Thanks very much. Raj, I really appreciate the powerful presentation that you just gave. To ground our conversation now, can you just restate the 5 characteristics of high mobility places that your research has uncovered?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 5 key patterns we find are that places with less residential segregation, a larger middle class, stronger family structure, higher levels of social capital, and better school quality tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. And that's true both at the national level and across neighborhoods within a city.
So, Lamia, you work with a global coalition of 50 champion mayors who want to foster inclusive economic growth in your work at the OECD. Does this list of 5 characteristics seem to apply at the international level? And if so, what are some of the policy levers that mayors can use to create places that have these 5 characteristics that Raj has identified as being crucial?
Yes, sure. First of all, I would like to say that these 5 factors, these 5 characteristics are very relevant. But of course, we have to take into account the fact that, you know, depending on countries, some countries like the United States value equality in terms of opportunities, while other countries like Sweden, they are valuing equality of outcomes first. Second things, we have to recognize that although absolute social mobility has increased almost everywhere in all countries, relative social mobility has declined or has stagnated in most countries in the OECD. So within this debate, you know, this debate about social mobility, we have been addressing that as part of our inclusive growth initiative and our agenda on inequalities. And what we have found out, we are now talking about cities, right? But we have to remember that actually the situation of cities versus other type of region is much better, that the urban-rural divide still exists, but our data has shown that actually disparities within cities have increased. The Gini coefficient within cities is much higher than the national average in almost all our metropolitan region. We have a metropolitan database of 280 metropolitan regions. So this is a generic trend, of course, with some exception. And what is also interesting to note is that this is even more exacerbated in large cities. So the size matter. Now, the question about segregation, we have identified the fact that segregation has also aggravated over the last decade. In most countries, we have now more and more ghettos of rich coexisting with ghettos of poor, but the drivers are a little bit different from one country to the other. I'd like also to mention, for instance, the fact that you have been, you know, concentrating on the US. The most segregated city in the US, they are at a comparable level to the least segregated cities in France and the Netherlands. So we have to take all this context into account. So what we have been doing with this inclusive growth initiative, and the Champion Mayor Coalition is one component of this initiative, is to try to identify which are the policy levers for local, but also for other upper levels of governments, because the central government they have a key role to play also to address these issues. So the first one that we have identified is access to job quality, the question of job, economic development. Mm-hmm. And here we have been looking at, you know, different type of roles that the cities can play in fostering entrepreneurship, promoting skills, employment, training, and so on. And there are some cities, you know, that have been really targeting some disadvantaged communities in distressed neighborhoods. I can give you an example. For instance, in Sweden, you know, in Stockholm is one of our champion mayor. So they have been really promoting specific entrepreneurial policy in disadvantaged areas. The second policy levers is about education, access to equitable education. We know very well that the question of segregation in school is very much related, explain a lot, you know, this trends toward socioeconomic segregation. So there are many policies, some are much more controversial than the others, but cities have a key role to play to provide information to parents to exert their school preference, But they can also invest sometimes. Of course, there is a question of availability of financing. But we have the mayor of Birmingham, United States, for instance. He has launched the Bell Education Program, providing city grants to invest in improving the quality of the teachers, but also improving the built environment of the schools. But again, you know, this is very much challenged by the capability of the local municipality, you know, to exert their spending in this area. The third policy levers is about social housing, you know, providing affordable housing to all. And here again, there are a lot of local, national initiatives. Sometimes they are in contradiction. And we need to be very careful because we have identified many examples where such policies, which originally aims to, you know, to promote integration and social inclusion, end up by further gentrification.
Right.
So we have identified that. In cities from emerging market economies or developing countries, there is this question about building new cities in areas where you don't have even, you know, appropriate roads, completely disconnected from the rest. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that all these housing policies are part of an urban generation strategy. Mm-hmm. This is very important. The other policy levers that we have identified is transport. Everybody agrees that transport is key because transport basically can disconnect people from jobs and from other economic opportunities. This is really issues. And here I just want to mention one thing. It's very important that the question of metropolitan governance is addressed. Mm-hmm. Because in general, you know, you cannot, this is something that should be addressed at the level of urban functional areas. And if you don't have one single agency that is, or at least a mechanism of coordination, it's just impossible to respond to this concern. Mm-hmm. I was in Seoul last week for our Champion Mayors for Inclusive Growth initiative, and the mayor of Seoul, he did a lot of work in his big city. I give you one figure that is interesting. 80% of the population in Seoul can have access to a bus station within 10 minutes, for instance. So
what's the fifth policy level?
And the fifth and last is health and other public services. Health, you know, Baltimore, London, the life expectancy can differ by 20 years across different neighborhoods. This is really amazing. One interesting example is the mayor of Mexico City, Mayor Mancera, who launched this El Médico en tu Casa initiative, where actually the city is delivering medical services at home to those disadvantaged population who don't have medical care, for instance. And last but not least, you know, I'd like to mention that nobody's talking about that, and it's really crucial, the question of food, mm-hmm. and the question to have access to healthy food and nutrition. We have identified a number of countries, the so-called food desert, where people don't have even access to grocery and healthy, fresh food around the corner. So it's really difficult.
So Jonathan, similarly, you're putting a new thing on the city agenda in terms of financial empowerment and financial security for families. Certainly coming from a country like the United States, we don't see that as a municipal responsibility in the same way that we see transportation or garbage pickup. Why is financial security so important for city governments to invest in and support?
Well, we felt that mayors weren't busy enough, so we thought we'd give them something to add to their agenda. You know, as we struggle with economic mobility, there's a really startling statistic that just came out of the Pew Research Center, which said that 90% of Americans prioritize economic stability over mobility. So the question is, why? Why is that so? 60% of American families experienced a financial shock in the last year, and over a third of them had income fluctuations of at least 25%. So this concept of economic instability is not only something which takes precedence in people's minds as they think about their futures and struggle with their presence, But I think it's something that we learned certainly in city government in New York back in 2008, and so many other mayors did, which is that this concept of individual and family financial stability is more than just a personal problem. It's more than just a community organization type of an issue, but it really became part of the bedrock of the communities and neighborhoods across our country and the world that suffered so mightily with the economic shocks back in 2008. The mayors learned the hard way that this was their issue. And I think that the lucky thing, as Mayor Hidalgo said here in Paris, is that there's so much uniquely that mayors can do to address these issues. Public programs are touching these populations. They are touching them often with money. And so financial empowerment programs that mayors have been investing in the last few years include banking access programs, creating public financial counseling, one-on-one type programs. And I think that the reason that these programs are showing so much success is that, as you heard earlier, not only do mayors feel the immediate need for solution, but mayors design programs for scale, and mayors have to design programs for quality, because when they get it wrong, they're going to hear about it right away. And so this push for quality at the same time one is pushing for scale has a really interesting effect in the financial empowerment world. It has meant that when a mayor stands in front of his or her public and says, if you are struggling with debt, for example, and you need one-on-one financial counseling, we can help you. And the ability to offer consistent quality services, the ability to measure the impact on reducing debt and building savings, has made these investments in public programming, like these financial empowerment centers I mentioned, so important. One other piece I want to be sure to mention is that as mayors have started building out their capabilities in their administrations for financial empowerment services, dealing with people's banking access, dealing with their personal finances, dealing with early starter savings for cushions, they have started integrating these services, this expertise, into an array of other social services which suffer from the financial instability of the people they're trying to help. And so you're seeing counseling integrated into housing programs, into workforce development programs, prisoner reentry programs, domestic violence services, on and on. Programs where people are being driven to ask for help because of their financial instability, and in many cases are being prevented from absorbing that help because what's happening in their day-to-day world is making life too unstable. The one example I want to give real quickly, one of our mayors in Lansing, Michigan, integrated financial counseling into a prisoner reentry program. And they started measuring the primary effect, which is wonderful, the debt being reduced, the credit scores being improved, et cetera. But because of this integration, they also started to take a look at the host effect, we call it the supervitamin effect, on the host program. And so they started seeing that people coming out of the prison system through these services who got the financial counseling were leaving supportive housing 32 days faster if they had the counseling than if they didn't. And so now all of a sudden this investment in financial empowerment and this counseling service isn't just an extra thing to put on a mayor's busy plate, but it's actually a really smart investment to help people get ahead sooner with the services they're absorbing.
That's great. So I think the two key points, one that ties back to what Raj says, is that you can't climb up the ladder until you stop falling down the ladder.
That's
and
right.
So economic stability is sort of the first step to enable people to create economic mobility. And your point about investment leads naturally to a question for Dag Detter, the author of Public Wealth of Cities. It's clear from Jonathan's experience and also from things that Raj has written that these investments in economic stability and economic mobility will pay for themselves over time. Raj has noted, for example, that the children who benefit from economic mobility investments pay more in taxes in the future than it costs to get them sort of up the ladder. Unfortunately, cities often feel that they don't have the ability to make the initial investments. But your book and your work turns that on its head and says that in fact cities do have the funds if they can manage their asset portfolio intelligently. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Every city is actually sitting on a gold mine. And if we manage this professionally, we would be able to generate the same amount of funds, sometimes even more than we are generating from taxes today in most cities around the world. This has been working for decades in cities around the world, in Asia and Europe. Hong Kong, Singapore are very famous examples. Most recently in Europe, we have Copenhagen, we have Hamburg, and they have been funding infrastructure, they have been funding social development by managing these assets more professionally. The reason that you even have some examples in the US, like the Mormon Church. We have a school district in Texas that has been doing this, etc. But the reason why it's not been spreading like a wildfire that it should be is that governments don't have balance sheets. This is quite surprising for everybody coming from the private sector, where balance sheet is a fundamental tool. And so the first step for any city, which could be a challenge until next year's meeting, is to do a treasure map. Every city should be looking at what assets they have, which is quite a challenge, and then do evaluation of those assets. And we are talking about real estate, which is the most hidden asset, but we're also talking about operational assets like utilities, transportation assets, ports, airports, etc. And putting them together in a holding company that makes them, with a balance sheet, of course, that makes it possible to hire professional managers. This is the key. So it's not really rocket science. It's what's done in the private sector every day. The question is just that we haven't done it in the public sector. It's very easy to do. It is actually as easy as it sounds. The secret sauce is really political will, which is not a small thing, because you will step on a lot of toes. You will have to, there's a lot of stakeholders who sees, this is maybe not in their interest, but for the greater good, for the society as a whole, this is a way of funding. This is a very good way of funding both infrastructure and social programs like this one.
Raj, when you've heard from Lamia talking about the policy levers that make economic mobility possible, whether mayors are acting, as you said, at the place-based interventions, people-based interventions, or neighborhood scale. When you hear Jonathan talking about government understanding that this is their role and that financial stability and mobility can be a super vitamin for some of their other effects, and you hear Dag saying, it's possible, the money is there. How does that resonate with you or integrate with your research and the work that you're doing with local governments? Does this sound, if you put all of this together, is there really an equation for for advancing economic mobility?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're talking about some of the critical ingredients here, right, in terms of what interventions are necessary to improve outcomes, what other barriers have to be removed before you can actually get to higher mobility, and namely increasing financial stability, and how do you pay for everything, right? And so I think one of the critical things to note is that in the long term, I think in many of these cases, these investments really pay for themselves. And so that's why the issues you were raising, Doug, about how you can overcome the liquidity constraints that cities basically face to put up that capital up front, I think are also critical to think about. The one other element I would add from my perspective that I see as absolutely critical is measurement and evidence and data. Because I think the way to really make these policies scale is to show people precisely this works in this setting, and this is exactly what the problem is. And I think now in many cities around the world, many countries around the world, you tend to have this type of data in one of your government systems, or typically in lots of different government systems, and pulling that together in a coherent way and working with the right set of people so you can extract lessons from that data, I think is a crucial step forward as well.
Thank you for that addition. So this conversation, I hope, has encouraged you or enticed you to learn more about the work of Jonathan, Lamia, Dag, and Raj, because again, together, I think this is a powerful formula for enabling cities to do what they do best, which is to be engines of prosperity and opportunity and enable people to live full lives for themselves and their children. So please join me in thanking our extraordinary panel.
Thank you.